What has this administration accomplished?
The volcano employment for April rises to a record. Country are now at 56,000.
Unang bahagi ng Social Amelioration Subsidy.
The resolution to deny ABS-CBN franchise application.
Anti-terrorism bill has been signed into law.
Good afternoon and welcome to the IBON 2020 Midyear Birdtalk Forum. I'm Audrey De Jesus, your moderator for today's program. This is the first ever online Birdtalk Forum in observance of safety and health protocols amid COVID-19. So this activity is in partnership with Alter Media, Now You Know, FYT or Fight, Seesaw Channel, and Rappler. Birdtalk is IBON Foundation's semi-annual socio-economic and political briefing. And the Mid-Year Birdtalk in particular is held to present IBON's halftime assessment of major economic and political developments ahead of the President's State of the Nation address. At the midpoint of 2020, we've been confronted by the worst health and socioeconomic crisis in the country's history due to the ongoing pandemic and one of the longest lockdown periods in the world. So today's Birdtalk aims to assess where we are and what steps need to be taken. Our presentations this afternoon will concentrate on the theme of pandemics, crisis, and tyranny. So we are happy to have with us today representatives from various schools, religious and civil society groups, people's organizations, government agencies, offices from the Senate and House of Representatives, and of course our friends from the media. We also have health frontliners, consumers, environmental and agricultural and industry advocates that we'll hear more from during the open forum later on. So thank you again all for joining us this afternoon. But before we proceed, let's review our house rules muna. So number one, this program is being live streamed on the official Facebook and YouTube accounts of IBON, as well as through our media partners. We mentioned earlier Alter Media, Now You Know, FYT, Seesaw Channel, and Rappler. And the proceedings of this forum are also being recorded for documentation purposes. For our Zoom participants, your video and mic shall be turned off during the presentations. So you may send your questions, comments, or announcements to our tech team via the chat box, and you can unmute or click the raise hand feature during the open forum. For those of you on Facebook and YouTube, please feel free to share your thoughts with us via the comment section. Our Q&A team are on standby to answer your inquiries or relay them to our hosts and resource speakers. The presentations shall be mailed to the participants after the program. And those of you that need certificates, these will be also provided upon request. So let's now go to the main event, the main portion of our forum. As we know, COVID-19 cases have now reached almost 69,000, and there are reports of more and more hospitals and frontliners that are increasingly overwhelmed. But the administration says that it has been successful in its health response. So what is the real situation, and how has government's health response been so far in dealing with the pandemic, and how is this related with the Duterte government's political agenda? To help us answer these questions, our first speaker finished her AB Economics degree at the University of the Philippines, Manila, and her master's degree on sociology at UP Diliman. She is a member of the IBON Board of Trustees and is currently IBON's research head and executive director. So let's please welcome Ms. Rosario Guzman. Hello, Roseby. Good afternoon.
Hi, Audrey. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, thank you. Good afternoon to all our viewers right now, our participants who would otherwise be with us physically this afternoon, but due to this situation we're in right now, we're trying out new technology. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. I would just like to correct, I am the executive editor, concurrently the head of research department. And I don't know if you're flashing my PowerPoint. I prepared 600 slides. No, just kidding, just 6 slides. So are we okay with the PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes, okay.
The failed COVID response is about profits and power. So you were saying earlier that the Duterte administration actually has a self-serving agenda. Why we have such a massive failure, no? The government has such a massive failure in responding to the pandemic. And yes, indeed, we are seeing how the administration has single-mindedly pursued, no, yung two ways. No? One is to how to enrich the economic elite and especially those in his inner circle, and on the other way is to how to set the pace of accumulating more power and staying in power for a long time. And this self-serving agenda manifests not only in how yung government has failed miserably to flatten the curve, no, and contain the virus, but also in how it has exploited the pandemic to push for more profits and more power. I have prepared five manifestations of this self-serving agenda, and one you're seeing right now is the militarized response itself. So, kapag tiningnan natin, yung National Task Force is headed by the Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana. Ang Vice Chair niyan is the DILG Secretary Eduardo Año. And then the National Incident Command of the National Task Force is Office of the Presidential Assistant on the Peace Process, Secretary Carlito Galvez, who is also a former Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. So you have three generals at the helm of militarized response to a pandemic. And then if you are looking for a social amelioration program, then you go to the Department of Social Welfare and Development. The secretary there is also a former General Rolando Bautista. Or if you've been sick and you want to have you want to file claims with PhilHealth, then the president there is Ricardo Morales, who is also a former Philippine Army general. And you might have heard also when Cebu, is the city with the highest COVID cases, and in the matter of weeks, no, siya yung may pinakamalaking pagtaas. And so the IATF sent the DENR, no, Secretary Rolando Simato, who was also again a former general. So they sent him to Cebu. Now this shouldn't be surprising kasi before COVID, there were already 73 former military officers in 46 agencies of the bureaucracy, and 38 of them are in high positions. So what we're having right now is actually a deliberate, no, sinasadya, no, na militarized response. So there are one of the longest and strictest lockdowns in the world. We have already gained that notoriety, no. Saan naman tayo nakakita where the government deploys military troops, military tanks, no, sa mga barangay in the cities, and even helicopters to look for the virus. Saan tayo nakakita that there are more mass arrests of quarantine rules violators than at one point than the people getting tested, no? And of course, the local government units have used the pandemic to issue unconstitutional ordinances, for example, engaging in warrantless arrests. So in reality, the state, no, the government, the police, they use the protocol against mass gathering to target people's mobilizations, including yung relief giving, no, including even attending to community needs, and of course joining protest rallies against government's massive fail. So ginamit nila, no, yung protocol na yon na bawal ang mass gathering to go against or to go after, no, these people's mobilizations. So in the end, Duterte himself was already identifying the communists and the activists and not the virus as the enemy. In short, the government has taken advantage of the pandemic to normalize and reinforce the normalcy of using military forces to hold a new state power and portray now the people as the threat. So on the second slide is about the whole scandal, no, and disaster of how the Duterte government has consistently rejected the call for free mass testing, how the Department of Health has not ever met its own target testing capacity, never hired enough contact tracers, how we sorely lack personnel, health personnel, how they sorely lack the right remuneration, how they lack the personal protective equipment and test kits even for themselves. And if indeed it was a battlefield, no, kung ito nga isang gera, we have seen how the government has sent them to the front lines without any support. So the whole scandal of how the whole health system is overwhelmed now, no, by the number of needing healthcare and by the number of needing critical attention. Lahat ito, no, is the accumulated result of deliberate policy choices that the Philippine government has made. And one of those policy choices is privatization. Even the pathetic weakness, no, that we cannot even manufacture our own face masks, or that government cannot even fully support our scientists, or that government cannot even subsidize our own production, no, of nutritious foods. All these, no, are the disease of neoliberal policies. Tapos si Duterte, no, posturing as a populist demagogue, signed the Universal Healthcare Law without regard that beyond its appealing title, this law is actually pushing for a health system that is more insurance-driven than about direct service provision. No? The law is actually more about relying on private hospitals than building public hospitals or public health facilities and strengthening our health workers and our health personnel. The government's budget is actually the reflection of its policy choices. Health has a smaller budget than defense. It has a smaller budget than intelligence funds, than infrastructure, and even than pork barrel. No? So yung budget for epidemiology for 2020, for example, was even cut, no, by the Duterte administration. So the third manifestation of my next slide is that, you know, when you talk about recovering business and the economy, we're actually looking at the working people as the essential frontliners here. And that's from both sides, no? From the side of consumption and from the side of production. That is why sinasabi natin sa IBON na may dilemma yung administrasyon because it is pressured by big business to reopen the economy, while on one hand, it has not really ensured, no, the health and socioeconomic well-being of the working people. Government cannot even provide mass transportation for the workers to go back to work. No? So as of our last counting, doon sa ayuda na pinagmamalaki, no, ng pamahalaan, if you try to count that in the duration of the lockdown, actually each family received 48 pesos per day. And then the families of drivers, they received 75 pesos per day. The farmers received 43 pesos per day. The OFWs, 87 pesos per day. The workers, 127 pesos per day. So the Duterte administration cannot even follow its own ridiculously low poverty line of 355 pesos per day, no? So sasabihin niya ito yung ayuda at ito lang ang poverty line, no? You just need 71 pesos per day per person to be considered not poor, and yet when we are now in a lockdown, bibigyan mo kami ng mas maliit pa dyan. So there has been no additional dramatic government intervention in behalf of the working people during COVID. And if ever there has been in lockdown-affected sectors such as transportation or yung mga returning OFWs or even the education sector or even housing, no, for proper home quarantine, these interventions have been mostly anti-people. They're not interventions at all, no? Mas nagpalala pa sila ng kalagayan ng mga lockdown-affected sectors. So the Duterte government cannot even maximize and cooperate with the initiatives of private organizations, which is a mandate in the Bayanihan law, that it should cooperate with private organizations. And this would include civil society and people's organizations. So hindi niya yun, the government did not cooperate, no, in alleviating the socio-economic difficulty of the people, but instead the DSWD, for example, has imposed restrictions on the civil society and people's organizations. The police have arrested many of them, have slapped trumped-up charges against them, and have detained them. So that's the whole, not just insensitivity but indifference, but it's actually also, again, a deliberate policy choice over profits. The fourth manifestation, the next slide, is actually about how Duterte's economic managers, no, view economic recovery. No? For them, economic recovery means giving big business tax cuts and subsidy support. Economic recovery means government borrowing, no, for budgetary support and to infuse equity in the system using COVID as pretext. Economic recovery means continuing the infrastructure projects as the stimulus. So in the slide, you will see here, these are the SARS that named the COVID SARS, no? Mga charot. On the left side, you'll see that's Galvez. That's the presidential assistant on the peace process. And next to him is Vince Dizon, who is the head of BCDA and head of implementing the infrastructure program, Build, Build, Build. In the middle is Mayor Magalong of Baguio, who's been assigned as the tracer, as the tracing czar. And next is Mark Villar, the DPWH secretary. And next, the only doctor among the czars for COVID is Dr. Vega, the Undersecretary of DOH. So, you see, this picture only shows kung ano nga ba yung ibig sabihin ng economic recovery. No? The economic managers came up with what they call Progreso, which is the program for recovery with equity and solidarity. Fancy name. With 3 instruments. One is Bayanihan 2, worth 140 billion pesos, which is to stimulate small and medium businesses, such as online commerce, entertainment, tourism, agricultural marketing, and transportation, no? To stimulate them with loan guarantees, pautang, and capital support. The other instrument is Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentives for Enterprises Act, or CREATE. Again, another fancy name, but that is just the renamed CITIRA. The CITIRA is package 2 of the much discredited notorious train law. And the purpose of CREATE is to provide cuts in corporate income taxes. Ibig sabihin ay imbes na buwisan pa, no, yung malalaking negosyante ay bigyan sila ng tax cuts, which would amount to about 667 billion by 2027. And the third instrument is the General Appropriations Act of 2021. In short, the budget, and the purpose is to ensure that the budget will be designed for such economic recovery program. The priority of Progreso is to continue the grand infrastructure program, as I mentioned. And as you see there, that SARS are meant to really implement that. And the government is incentivizing a favorable condition. No? Naglalagay siya ng mga incentives, nangungutang siya to infuse equity so that there will be a favorable condition to continue its only and yet failed stimulus program called Build, Build, Build. So the Duterte administration knows, no, only build, build, build. Yan lang ang alam niya from the start. For the slowing economy, the economy has been slowing down for the past 3 years now. And now that the economy is collapsing, and the projects, no, that cater to transportation, travels, tourism, real estate, foreign trade, foreign investment, are also fast becoming irrelevant under COVID, yung pa rin ang alam ng government. The government is still keeping illusions about build, build, build. Not to mention that the half the amount no, of build, build, build are loans. So all these are to make the slowing and now collapsing Philippine economy remain attractive to foreign investments and the domestic economic oligarchs, no, in the same sectors that they have enriched themselves: trade, construction, real estate, tourism, shopping malls, hotels, restaurants, condominiums, water, energy, banking and financial services, automotive marketing, information and communications technology, and most recently, gambling. So the illusion, ito yung illusion. Why is it an illusion? Apart from, of course, it's COVID affected now. All these sectors will be affected by physical distancing and other restrictions to travel. Yung illusion, it lies in the fact that Build, Build, Build itself as a stimulus is not even stimulated. So only 2 of the 100 flagship projects are finished as of now. And the government is hoping that 38 may be finished by the end of Duterte's term. So not even half, and we are now, of course, saying that it's not even going to be 38. So at the end, no, which is my last slide, at the end, actually, all these illusions and all these difficulties are clear to the creditors, sa mga nagpautang sa atin. But what is important for them is that programs and policies that favor foreign investments, that favor them, no, and big corporations are unhampered. so that the Duterte government will not stop being blindly loyal, no, to the free market paradigm. So this is not surprising. Therefore, it's not surprising that in the light of an uncontrolled pandemic, the Duterte administration has pushed for policies and laws that uphold neoliberalism more than address the health crisis. And these are the same policies that have weakened the economy to face any emergency for that matter. And these are now packaged as the new normal. So, for example, in agriculture, the the agriculture department is saying a plan is the COVID response. But when you look at it, it's actually pushing for a market-driven and market-oriented kind of agriculture while neglecting and really setting aside issues of production and issues of self-reliance. When you look at the labor department, the labor advisory number 17 of the DOLE has already given a license to corporations to cut wages, to put workers on rotation, or to even retrench or just do away with half of the workforce. And that is already sort of licensed or legal in the name of the pandemic. And if you look at jeepney modernization, which is a corporate-driven solution, and to sell, no, modern jeepneys and to attract transportation corporations and even transportation investments, that's been pushed by the DOTR since 2017, and they're using again COVID as an excuse to really do away with the traditional jeepneys. Now we are already seeing on the table, no, on the agenda of Congress is the amendment to the Public Services Act, which means that transportation and telecommunications will be opened up to 100% foreign ownership. And we will not be surprised, and we are not no longer surprised that they are saying that charter change is also a policy that will address the pandemic. And charter change means opening up to 100% foreign ownership, natural resources and land ownership, media and broadcasting, and advertising, education, transportation, telecommunications, and everything else that are not yet that is not yet open to foreign investment. So what we're saying here is that for the creditors, it's all right as long as you remain loyal to free market, you remain loyal to neoliberal policies. But for the Duterte administration, again, it's a self-serving agenda, because being loyal to neoliberalism is also about it's self-preservation. It's being acceptable not just by the creditors but also by big business, and in the end being able to stay in power. So I guess that's it.
Manifestations of the self-serving agenda of the Duterte administration. And so we note that there's been a militaristic response as opposed to a health response, and that many of the policies they're pushing are not really there to address the needs of the people, but actually to serve more big business and for their own self-preservation to stay in power. So to talk more actually about, Roseby raised actually some points regarding the economic recovery stimulus plan, its economic response. So our next speaker will answer the questions of how do we assess the administration's economic response, and where is the Philippine economy heading in light of this. So for our next speaker, he has his finished his master's degree in development studies and bachelor's degree in philosophy and economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he's a member of the IBON Board of Trustees. So let's please welcome IBON's Executive Director, Sunny Africa. Hello, Sunny.
Yep. Hi, Audrey. Thank you. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see me. Yeah? Okay. Magandang hapon sa lahat. I hope everyone is keeping well and safe. Like Rosny, I'm going to, try and structure this with four or five, actually, five major points. The pandemic really was a surprise, but how we respond actually is within our control. And I think, it's been 6 months already. I think quite clearly it's been long enough to conclude that the worst outcomes of the pandemic are actually because of the poor government response. It's falling far short of what we need to deal with the magnitude of the crisis. There's been a huge human suffering during the lockdown, and actually there's huge suffering to come, apart from, of course, as expected, massive economic losses. So my first major point, I think, which Roswell already touched on, I think we really have to keep on stressing that the failure to contain the pandemic really is the biggest source of economic uncertainty and instability. I think it's quite important that Rosby mentioned the privatization. Next slide, please. The health response really has been crippled by privatization. There's almost 69,000 cases as of yesterday. It's accelerating. It took over 3 months for the first 10,000 cases to happen, less than a week now for the last 10,000. So we're not beating the pandemic by any means, but what we are beating, unfortunately, are well, it turns out, over-optimistic projections previously. I remember that the last estimate I saw from the UP pandemic response team was estimating 60,000 by the end of July. We're not even there yet, but we're already at almost 69,000. Our health response has been compromised by decades of privatization. So we came in private profit seeking, which progressives have always complained about. Private profit seeking really frowns on excess capacity because excess capacity means idle capital and not enough profits. In the past, that's resulted in health services being in chronically short supply, aside from being too expensive. Now, the government, with its privatization approach, has made things worse by eroding public health capacity. And I think that's why I want to sort of show this slide. The eventual outcome of this whole pandemic depends on the spread, duration, and severity of the pandemic. But if you'll notice there, if you look at the health facilities enhancement program of the government, it's been falling for the last 3 years. Human resources have been basically stagnant. Very alarmingly, the epidemiology program was cut actually this year. And, there's a lot of talk about, the wonders of infrastructure, some kind of magic bullet for development. I think quite noticeable. The reason we're struggling right now, the reason the health system is so extremely overwhelmed is that infrastructure has not paid attention to hospitals and health facilities. As you can see, even infrastructure spending neglected health, and we've seen declines in the last few years. So if we're asking about how will the economy fare after the pandemic, of course it starts and ends almost with how do we deal with the pandemic. But also, I think two other things: the lockdown measures. Hopefully we've seen the last of those, but this government, I think from Rossby's input, you can see how inclined they are to militarist measures. But lastly, I think the macroeconomic response, of course, will factor into those results. Next slide, please. Now, I think it's stating the obvious, but well, sometimes you have to state the obvious because the government seems to neglect that. Relying on lockdowns have really caused the worst jobs crisis and economic decline in Philippine history. This combination of, next slide please, of lockdown overkill and the dragging health response, the lockdowns could have been avoided, or at least been much less drastic if you had responded earlier, and especially if you had a more robust and not privatized health system. But I think what makes things much more worse for people right now, that long lockdown, we're actually still in it, it appears to have been squandered. The virus is still spreading and the health system is still getting overwhelmed. So if this one sort of initial binding constraint sort of overcoming our economic crisis, it's the fact that the health problem is actually still getting worse. But focusing on the jobs crisis, the pandemic caused a supply and demand shock to economic activity. It's unprecedented in the modern era. It beats even wartime economies, which actually see bursts of production and productivity. This unprecedented supply and demand shock, simultaneous, has really huge multiplier effects. Income and livelihoods collapse on a large scale, far beyond the reported closures by Dole. They've tried very hard to give us updates about worker displacements, but For instance, the last report only had about 122,000 displaced workers as of July 13. Actually, I think that's quite important because the reason Dole underreports displacement so much is because they only report mainly firms in the formal economy. So, of course, the real state of unemployment is actually much worse than the as reported by Dole, but actually also even much worse than reported by the PSA. The April results said there were only 7.8 million who lost their jobs in April. But strangely, they only reported an additional 5 million unemployed. Now, a big problem is that the PSA doesn't count a lot of discouraged and non-job seeking Filipinos. So if you add on the official unemployment of 7.3 million, if you add to that the millions of discouraged and non-job seeking Filipinos who on a technicality weren't counted as unemployed, the real unemployment level is really 14 million. And we're actually seeing at least a 21% unemployment rate as of April. Now, sadly, even that unemployment rate doesn't capture the breadth of the problem because there's a clear particularity in the Philippine economy. We have such wide informality. Over 70% of the of employed and informal sector with irregular, uncertain work and no labor protections, but also it means a very low standard for being counted as unemployed. Now, if we count the absolute numbers of real unemployed, including those who are unemployed are employed in a low standard because in the informal sector, we're seeing at least 20 million. That's almost half of the labor force facing unemployment and serious underemployment in April 2020. I think that's quite important to stress because that's the problem we have to deal with in the coming period. Now, I think employment is the most important indicator of where the economy is. But of course, the headline figure is usually the GDP growth. Now, the economy started to contract in the first quarter at -2%, but that's only covering 2 weeks of lockdown. It's of course going to be much worse in the second quarter until the end of the year. What we want to highlight here is that the government, through the Development Budget Coordinating Council, they're over optimistic about the recovery in 2021. The 8 to 9% growth rate they estimate is too high, and it's actually mostly going to be a dead cat bounce. It's a recovery because it's measured from a drastic lockdown collapse in 2020. Actually, even the government's optimism is shared with the IMF or the ADB, which have much higher estimates for the economic collapse in 2020. And I think this is actually, I think, an important starting point. We can't come up with a good solution if you don't identify the problem properly. And I think it's very disappointing that the government, the economic managers, they overly believe the economic propaganda that the economy was strong coming to the pandemic. It wasn't, and despite its best infrastructure efforts, it's actually been weakening. Next slide, please. Now, I think the biggest question right now for us is, so what is the government doing to sort out the economic difficulties? Categorically, the proposed stimulus the government is proposing is much too small and it leaves the people behind. The problem there is that if you look at, next slide, please. The economic problem is not just the lockdowns. Hopefully that's at an end. But these lockdowns and the collapse in economic activity, they're just the opening salvo, although very dramatic, of a long period of subdued economic activity because of repressed demand and disrupted production. As long as the pandemic is there, as long as the uncertainty is there, we won't see a tapering off of the supply and the demand shocks. Now, this means that the government has to counter the decline in aggregate demand by vastly increasing its spending, as well as support distressed enterprises and the large informal economy. Now, unfortunately, even with the easing of lockdowns, the economy is facing formal and informal enterprises have closed, and even those who remain open, their business operations are going to be disrupted. Now, among those who are employed, because there's so many in the informal sector, a lot of work is actually just become even more precarious, irregular, and uncertain. Households, I'm sure we're feeling this every day, much lower household spending from fear of getting sick outside, depleted savings from 4 months of lockdown, and of course the uncertain prospects. And of course, the economy has been so used to these remittances and foreign investment and exports for so long, it's going to be drastically disrupted in the coming period. Now, the response should be commensurate to the crisis at hand. But I think the economic managers have a problem with having put on a fiscal straitjacket. Their obsession with creditworthiness, free market forces, a regressive tax system is actually stopping the economy from recovering. Could you please put back the slide, please? Nope, go back. Sorry. Go back one more. Can you go back? No, back. Please, back. Oh, okay. Okay. I think there's a slide missing, but there's one important point I think we have to highlight about the. There we go. Yes, please. Um, the stimulus package is really too small. The economic managers rejected the 1.3 trillion stimulus bill originally proposed by Congress, and right now they're still agonizing over a much smaller 140 billion peso Senate proposal and 162 billion HOR proposal in the biennium too. Now, the peak of government spending happened in 2020, but you'll notice these are IMF estimates. These are much smaller compared to most of our neighbors in Southeast Asia. Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, they actually all have weaker fiscal and financial positions than the Philippines, but they're spending either equivalent amounts in the case of Malaysia, or actually even much more in the case of Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So this one thing that's becoming clear right now is government obsession with protecting creditworthiness in the interest of competitiveness and being attractive to for investment. Well, for the record, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, they're not as creditworthy as the Philippines. They have weaker fiscal and financial positions, but they're much more willing to spend on their populations. And I think one clear implication of that is they will be able to get up from this crisis much earlier than us. Next slide, please. Sorry, could you go back? Yeah, sorry. Back 2 slides to the circles. One more. Okay. This slide I think is important to show just exactly the problem with the government's approach. No, back. Oops. There. Okay. I think this is important to highlight. The big oval shows, well, these ovals cumulatively they show the distribution of employment in the economy. We have about 31 million in the informal sector, 2.8 million in government, which let's presume is mostly formal, and 9 million in formal enterprises. The government's approach, you see on the lower right hand side, they're very focused on supporting formal enterprises, whether through the Biennium 2, or through the Create corporate tax breaks, or even from the additional Banco Central liquidity. So I think that's right there we see a problem because a lot of the hype the government is spewing out about its response is actually focused on a very small part of the economy. It won't actually even reach all 9 million employed in formal enterprises. At the same time, it is very negligent about the conditions of the 31 million who are employed in the informal sector, and by extension, the poor households who were there. There's I think about 15 billion proposed for informal workers in the Biennium 2 proposal, but that's actually not going to help very much. Overall, we are seeing insignificant cash subsidies for the poorest households, and I think that's quite important to stress because the one-sidedness of the government response, this extreme focus on the supply side, that's going to be a big stumbling block to economic recovery. We won't have an economy getting up on its feet if people aren't spending, and people won't be spending if they're unemployed and if their incomes are compromised. So a lot of the demand side measures needed, meaning direct cash subsidies to support not just household welfare, but to give a consumption boost aggregate demand that's not being given enough attention. Actually, no, it's not being given any attention, period. The major demand side intervention of the government is infrastructure, but I think that's very problematic because it's subject to leakages to the extent that it's import dependent. So inadvertently will end up stimulating the economies we're importing the supplies, materials, equipment, and workers from. Also, if infrastructure is capital intensive, that's much less bang for your buck, and it won't be helping our local micro, small, and medium enterprises. So we're very categorical that ultimately the current design of the government stimulus program, it neglects and leaves behind poor households, tens of millions of informal workers, and as well unregistered micro, small, and medium enterprises. Next, please. Now, I think we've got lots of problems. We have lots of problems with having to deal with the lockdowns, with the immediate pandemic problem. But I think we have to remember we had economic problems even before the pandemic. And without real reforms in economic policy, the structural problems of the economy are just going to get worse. The government is strangely oblivious to how drastically changed the world is. And if it's not keen on great changes in the world economy today, if it insists on its old economic proposals, these structural problems are going to remain. And I think it's quite easy to summarize. Our main structural problems are mass unemployment. We ended 2019, if you put the real unemployment figures into consideration, we ended 2019 with the most number of unemployed in Philippine history. The government hides that by not counting discouraged workers. We're facing chronic poverty and inequality. A lot of the poverty decline was mainly through cash transfers. It's quite artificial. Poverty should be resolved not by cash transfers only, but by creating jobs. Inequality is awful in the country. I think that's also quite clear. And structurally, we're a service economy more than a producing economy. Agriculture is failing. There's no Filipino industry, well, no significant Filipino industry to speak of. And until we resolve being a service economy so dependent on, artificial and external sources of growth like remittances, foreign investment, and debt, unemployment, poverty, and inequality won't be resolved. Now, I think one strange, next slide please, one very strange attitude of the government right now is that it doesn't seem to think that there's a problem. We're getting a sense that they think, the pandemic's a little speed bump, just get over that bump, then you're okay. But it's so strange, they don't seem to realize the world is facing its worst global recession since the Great Depression. And in response to that, even the most advanced capitalist powers are becoming increasingly protectionist and asserting economic nationalism. Now that's very weird because I remember we attended a DTI consultation a few weeks ago. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it's China-centered. Someone asked in the seminar, did the government change its premises in discussing the free trade agreement RCEP with the pandemic? They said there was no change at all. So that's very not suspicious. It's a bit strange because India, for instance, pulled out of the RCEP. India has, in some respects, a much stronger industrial agricultural base than us. But in November last year, they already pulled out of RCEP. It seems very strange that this dogmatic adherence to free trade and the free market, the government is still holding on to that despite drastically changed global conditions. And I think at the very least, the fact that China and the US are in an escalating trade war, the fact that countries in Europe, including the UK, are becoming more protectionist, even countries in Latin America like Brazil, Argentina, they also become more protectionist. We will be seeing that in Southeast Asia as well. So it doesn't make sense for the Philippines to sort of ignore changes in the global policy regime. If anything, we have to adapt changes in the global policy regime. Now, one thing also I think is important to flag, apart from slowing growth in the global economy, we're also possibly facing a new global financial and economic crisis. The world ended 2019 with $255 trillion in debt. That's about 322% of global GDP. These are the highest levels of debt in the world's history, which can only get worse in 2020 because of the pandemic. So, if you'll recall, the 2009 global financial crisis was triggered by unpayable debt. So I think that sort of medium-term risk has become very much heightened now, which I think also highlights that we have to change our economic strategy. And the government is so oddly adhering to its same economic strategy as before. It insists that we ended the pandemic strong, which isn't true. We've seen we're heading to our fourth year of slowing growth, despite hugely growing infrastructure spending, despite reportedly the highest FDI in the country's history. We were faltering before, the economy was slowing before the pandemic. Current conditions will just make those problems even worse. And I think, unfortunately, a big part of the government's economic response is just recycling old market reforms unrelated to the pandemic or the economic crisis this caused. Rosli mentioned Build, the Create Law, the Public Service Act amendments, agricultural liberalization, and the other day, apparently, they're using their hold over the League of Mayors to push changes in the Charter's economic provisions. Now, at the very least, these are irrelevant to dealing with the pandemic. At worst, they will even damage the economy in the medium term. We will have even more unviable debt-driven infrastructure projects. We'll have a much narrower tax base from the Create Law. We're even going to lose a potential revenue base. For instance, if the public service amendments take place and we have more foreign investors in our utilities. Agriculture will weaken, domestic industry will not go stronger, especially with falling exports and amid slower foreign investment. And, all this just, aggravates or aggregated demand is so low. We're even seeing possibly higher consumption taxes, and certainly we're going to be seeing lower wages. So the demand side of the economy really needs to have to be paid much more attention to, as well as getting rid of our sacred cows in terms of neoliberal free market economics. Last major point, I think, the pandemic, sadly, sinasabi nga, the words for crisis and opportunity in Chinese are the same, or they have the same character. Well, unfortunately, the pandemic crisis was used as an opportunity by the administration to strengthen authoritarianism and actually to support corporate and crony profits. So the pandemic hasn't just resulted in the most serious public health crisis and economic decline in the country's history. It's actually also ushering in, I think, the most dangerous moment for Philippine democracy since the declaration of martial law and dictatorship in the 1970s. Next slide. The Philippine situation since 2016, actually under President Duterte, is part of a larger global trend of populist and authoritarian governments. This is worsening with the coronavirus pandemic, and it will actually shape the post-virus world. Right now, even before the pandemic, the Philippines was among the front lines of a global decay in democracy, in liberal democracy, where we were sharing the front lines with US, India, Brazil, UK, Poland, Hungary, and so many other countries moving in autocratic directions. While of course China and Russia have always been notable stalwarts of countervailing non-liberal democratic political systems. Now, the government's actions in terms of authoritarianism during the pandemic, I think this is the most worrying part. Even just in terms of dealing with the pandemic, its authoritarian maneuvers are really just stoking social divisions and distrust. Just when we have this huge pandemic crisis to face, to deal with it, we need wide social consensus, an atmosphere of unity, an atmosphere of mutual trust. But if anything, for the government, the people are the enemy. These themes of pasaway, lack of discipline, this overstress on militarist lockdown. If the people are going to be thought of as the enemy, we're not going to build the consensus and unity and trust we need to deal with the pandemic. Now, unfortunately, I want to finish up with what Ross B already raised. The administration is really relentless in pushing its political agenda of staying in power, whether through the 2022 elections or even charter change. But of course, we know it's aware of popular expectations since the Marcos dictatorship. We still like our liberal democracy. So the government is still careful to maintain this sort of veneer or semblance of democratic institutions. But I think it's very clear. For the past 3 years, the administration has worked hard to centralize power by subverting or co-opting the executive branch, Congress, and the judiciary. Its supermajority in Congress is incredible. It basically has almost total control of the government right now. Again, although within a liberal democratic gloss or a facade. But this isn't enough, and the government needs to keep the citizens in check. It used the pandemic to advance on two main fronts for this. Systematic disinformation to keep people misinformed, and also forcefully putting down the most organized groups struggling for democratic reforms. Now, I think it's quite clear that attacks on press freedom, we all know about that, against ABCB and against Rappler. I don't think it's a surprise why even, individual social media users have been intimidated for their critical government posts. But of course, the crown jewel of political repression under the administration is, of course, the pushing of the anti-terror law. And I think it's also worth repeating, they prioritize the anti-terror law even over a stimulus program for the economy, which I think really puts into stark highlights in what the government's priorities are. But at the same time, it's not just about the politics. Any government's political base always has to have the support, more or less, of the big business community. The Duterte administration is still keeping the support of basically big caps in the Philippines by insisting on that market-oriented, pro-capital economic policy framework. But on the side, which is tolerated by free market policies, crony capitalism. Of course, this interacting of business interests with governments is most visible with the meteoric rise of Dennis Uy to the ranks of the country's richest, but also with things like the Villar family being well positioned in the Senate, Public Works, and Justice departments to support their core businesses. And that's actually, I think, the bigger problem we're facing. I mean, there's also the not really smaller issues, but the more immediate concerns of rumors of PPE and test kit contracts going to companies linked to government officials, of government authorities being used to harass possible competitors. I mean, of course, hopefully there'll be more information on that in the future, but I think in a lot of cases, especially in the Philippines, where there's smoke, where there's fire. But also, one striking example of how the government is using the pandemic to favor crony or monopolistic interest was the proposed Bayanihan 2 stimulus package, allowing actually for a lot of discretion for the government to exempt corporations from laws like the Government Procurement Act or the Competition Act or monitoring of GOCCs, and also to give out tax breaks. And I think it's at the point that even the Philippine Competition Commission was alarmed that the Bayanihan 2's provisions were crony or monopolistic interests. So hopefully that doesn't pass. But the point is, systematically the government's economic policies are not actually being used to favor the people. It is not siding with the people, it's siding with big business, including foreign big business. Now, I want to close with, well, I think it's so frustrating sometimes, and a lot of us are getting very upset or maybe depressed that this constant use of the powers, authority, and resources of the government for self-serving political economic gain that's been around for so long, it just seems to be getting worse. But I think if there's one silver lining to all of this, it really has spurred an upsurge in protest. Concerns and anxiety about getting sick haven't stopped activists, civil society, discontented communities, and basically outraged citizens from taking to the streets in growing numbers. So while on one hand, there's a very clear authoritarian drift in the country's governance, I think we can sort of be happy. We are also seeing a democratic upsurge. Filipinos are not going to take any of these abuses lightly, and I think no matter how dark things might seem right now, there will always be some light at the end of that tunnel. Thank you.
For your presentation and deepening the discussion regarding these policies of the government and where it's taking the country and the Filipino people. So I'm sure all of you out there watching are brimming with questions that you want to ask our resources speakers, Sunny and Rose B. So let's begin our Q&A segment by starting the conversation with our friends in the media. So the way of the Q&A is we're going to first start with our friends from the media, and then we also have some a Q&A portion for representatives from various sectors, and then we'll open up to an overall forum for questions coming from the chat box, from the comment section, from FB and YouTube. So our first speaker, a representative from the media to share their thoughts and any questions that they have. Let's welcome Kenneth Guda of Alter Media and Pinoy Media Center. Hello, Kenneth. Okay. Wala kang audio? Okay na. May audio ka na? Hello? Okay, so while Kenneth is addressing his tech difficulties, why don't we go to our next media representative? Can we welcome Atom Arroyo of FYT or Fight, GMA. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Hello. Okay, Sunny? Let's see. I think we're having a bit of technical difficulty. Wala silang audio. Okay. Okay. Um, yes, I'm actually typing the question because they're unable to hear your audio. So again, Roseby and Sunny, Atom would like to know what kind of reforms can we begin immediately to set us in the right direction based on what was shared on the assessment of the economy, and what advice could we give to policymakers? So did you catch that, Sunny or Roseby? Okay, apparently we still have some technical difficulties.
Can you hear me, Audrey?
Yes, Sunny, we can hear you now.
Okay. I think in terms of reforms, it's so straightforward. Right now, we have to establish first this, broad sense that we're all facing a common problem. So all these divisive actions by the government, treating the people as the enemy, no? Yes, I'm actually typing the question because they're able to hear your audio. So again, Rosie and Sunny, Atom would like to know what kind of reforms can we begin immediately to set us in the right direction based on what was shared, the assessment of the economy, and what advice could we give to policymakers? So did you catch that, Sunny or Rosie? Yeah, I heard that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we still have some technical difficulties. Audrey? Yes, Sunny, we can hear you now. Okay. Okay. I think in terms of reforms, it's so straightforward. Right now, we have to establish first this, broad stance that we're all facing a common problem. So all these divisive actions by the government, taking the people as the enemy, no, no. Audrey?
Yes. Sorry, they're addressing the technical difficulties.
Okay.
But continue. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think step one, there's a change of orientation needed. Not to treat the people as the enemy, but instead allies in the fight against the pandemic. I think that will have a lot of far-reaching implications in terms of mobilizing people's initiative, enthusiasm, and cooperation with responding. So that can be quantified, but I think that's a starting point. So that means a lot of the divisive rhetoric and actions have to be reined in. On that basis, I think this is where the resources come in. We really have to improve our health response. It is just so tragic that nearly 6 months into the pandemic, we're still apparently keen on using the lockdown as our primary weapon against the pandemic when it was never meant to be the primary weapon. Lockdowns are meant to be the last resort, to buy time. The main weapon really is the people also helping with testing, tracing, the isolation, the quarantining, all the precautionary measures. So government has to give a lot more attention to doing, well, attending to the basics. And I think it's of course not just a matter of spending more, but that's a starting point. It's also a matter of doing things better. So a much more coordinated health response, more effective health response is needed. Astride that, because the government has done so badly in containing the virus, I think people suffering from the disease already should be given much more support. That won't contain the virus, but at least alleviate their suffering. In terms of the economy, I think the one big gap in the government's approach right now is they need to focus on aggregate demand. They need to consider very strongly much bigger cash subsidy goals. Even estimated at least 200 to 300 billion pesos a month for at least 3 months is essential. that really jumpstarts the economy, that will encourage especially local micro, small, and medium enterprises to um, maintain operations, to reinvest. That actually will be the key to making sure that all this liquidity the government's throwing to the economy will be used, because it's very hard to have economic activity if no one's spending. So I think that big boost in aggregate demand will not just improve people's welfare immediately, it also helps set into motion a virtuous cycle of supply and demand kicking in. In particular, I think a third important point is the government has to give much more support to Filipino micro, small, and medium enterprises. We pointed out that the amounts the government are giving are too small. We also noticed that they were too focused on formal enterprises, including large enterprises potentially. I think there should be a much bigger amount package of support for Filipino micro, small, and medium enterprises. Um, yes, it helps to give them access to credit, but of course, the whole range of measures of sorting out supply chains, sorting out their transport and logistic problems. I think those are all going to be helpful. But the government actually has a very keen eye already on how to support businesses. So we think that can be improved slightly, but what needs substantial improvement really is giving more cash subsidies to people and then increasing the package all around.
Okay. Ato, may follow-up question ka ba? Or Roseby, would you like to add?
Napag-uusapan yung pagbibigay um, ng ayuda, basically ng aid sa boost sa economy that way. But can you also give us some level of detail doon sa kung paano pwedeng i-support yung MSMEs in contrast with what they are doing already, supporting big business and yung mga foreign investors in the Philippines?
Sige. Okay. Actually, okay ba?
Yes.
Okay, sige. Okay, this weird, parang I'm in an echo chamber. I think, again, baka I wasn't very clear then. I think the 140 billion pesos stimulus package is not going to be enough. So there has to be a much bigger parang pile of resources to be used for helping micro, small, and medium enterprises. Ngayon, specifically what's needed. Actually, the government has laid out in the We Recover as One proposal program, they've laid out a lot of things about improving the marketing, about supporting research and development, about providing the transport and logistical infrastructure to make sure that supply chains aren't broken. Actually, those are good in themselves. But the thing is, because the amount being spent on those items are so small, there's a danger that they might come out as parang motherhoods or empty unfunded platitudes. So I think kung in terms of what specific needs are going to be helpful for micro, small, and medium enterprises, the financing is of course absolute. Right now, tigil yung negosyo kasi. So they have to sort out their balance sheets. I think cheap financing, cheap credit really will be important. Pero ito nga yung earlier point namin, in itself, kahit anong ibuhos mo in terms of cheap credit, yung negosyo ay hindi mag-i-invest, hindi uutang at mag-i-invest, wala bumibili ng kanyang produkto. And I think dun mahalaga na ituring na hindi magkahiwalay yung bibili na cash subsidies. Especially because if you give large cash subsidies, more than an infrastructure project, halimbawa na Mega Manila Subway, if you give a large cash subsidies across the population, lalo na sa mga distressed communities, halimbawa in NCR, gagastusin ng mga poor households yun sa local economy nila. Actually, that would drive yung local micro, small and medium enterprises na, okay, dahil may pupunta naman actually sa tindahan ko, sige, utang na ako dun sa provide ng government. Doon mag-make sense, sige, improve natin yung marketing natin. Sige, mag-online marketing tayo. Doon pwede, sige, mag-invest tayo in new farm machinery or invest tayo in new internet-based na mga equipment. Parang maganda actually yung nakahani ng government sa We Recover as One. Eh. But the big gap is, kahit anong supply side measure mo, kung walang bumibili, walang say-say yung supply side measures na yon. So, menu of options lamang, I think, maganda yung menu of options ng government sa We Recover as One. Sana mas malaking funding lang nun para mas maraming makabot. Pero second key point, apart from dagdagan yung pondo, create mechanisms na kahit yung informal, micro, small, and medium enterprises maabot. Kasi medyo delikado yung ginagawa ng government na mag-register muna kayo tapos bibigyan namin kayo ng tulong. Si Nego Secretary Chua, ilang beses ini-insist yun eh. Kaso, ang mangyayari dyan, paano nangyari doon sa mga social remuneration programs natin? Kung maglagay ka ng bureaucratic na balakid, by the time matanggap yon, patay na yung kabayo. Ganoon din sa ekonomiya. Ang bagal na nga ng pagpagula ng stimulus package at kung gagawa ng stimulus package, papatumbling pa yung mga negosyo para matap yung stimulus package na yon. Kung sasara sila before actually ang makikinabang doon. So, second key point doon is, I think make it easier, lalo na for the fast unregistered micro, small, and medium enterprises, make it easier for them to get that amount. So, para maging clear lang, no? Yung three major things na pwede gawin to help micro, small, and medium enterprises, give cash subsidies. Guarantee the cash yan locally. That will help micro, small, and medium enterprises give them a market. Secondly, dun sa existing menu of options ng government, fund it more. Huwag yung napakabariyang ngayon na binibigay nila na proposals because you want to cast the net wider. And third, really make sure it reaches those most in need. Let go of the bureaucratic requirements. And I think the government to realize this isn't the time to be stingy. Eh. Parang ang tindi ng crisis natin. It's actually the time to be generous. At yung very ironic sa amin, the government is insisting on its build projects, including big-ticket projects, which are very import-intensive and capital-intensive. Para sa amin, it's just so ironic na maglalabas ang perang gobyerno, but it's going to be spent abroad. Tapos the only gain we get is the few thousand workers in that construction project na pananalian lamang. So parang it's artificial and it's a huge leakage and it's not getting the biggest bang for our buck sa scarce funds natin. So medyo may konti. I think the government needs a major reorientation from yung nakasanayan ng mga economic policy proposals. And for us, one of the most nagging and worrying things is that the government hasn't changed fundamentally any of its economic policy thrusts with the pandemic. So parang parang speed bump lang na once we're over it, tapos na. And I think that's completely wrong. And this one thing that will prevent economic recovery is this narrow-mindedness and stinginess of our economic policy.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes. Wala siyang marinig. Ay, sorry. Sorry. Sige, tuloy na lang po. Okay. Hindi, okay. Sige, yung first question, Sunny, baka pwede mo muna sagutin yung unang question ni Ken.
Wala ako natinig.
Ay, wala din. Okay.
Wala po kaming naririnig. Sorry.
Hindi ako marunong mag-lip read.
Yes. Let's see if we can type in the question.
Natinig mo ba, Oz? Pa-share na lang. Audrey, we can hear you fine. I can.
Okay.
I can hear Audrey. Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Sige, Kenneth, could you please repeat the question one more time and then I'll relay it to them.
Pero, anyway. Sige.
Yes, go ahead, Kenneth.
Sa ibang bansa at ibang mga gobyerno napababa yung transmission rate nila. Mababang unemployment increase or rate, no, compared sa Pilipinas at sa iba pang mga matitindi yung unemployment na resulta ng crisis.
Okay.
Nakuha mo ba?
Yes, so regarding yung 14 million unemployment, Sunny and Roseby, ang tanong ni Kenneth is that what could the government have done in terms of response para hindi maging ganun taas ang 14 million unemployment? Tapos do we have examples from other countries where they had the correct or effective response so that hindi inabot sa ganun kataas ang unemployment levels nila? Tama ba?
Actually, the most important response sana sa government is huwag sana muna mag-lockdown ng ganun eh. I think babalik tayo panagin. Ang original sin ay yung bagal ng pag-respond ng government noong pumutok yung COVID. At I think uso ngayon at justifiably, malagang counter-example dyan, yung ginawa ng Vietnam. Yung ginawa ng Vietnam, nung unang makalat yung virus, ginawa rin nila yung sinasabi natin parang mantra ng test, trace, isolate, quarantine. Kung ginawa yun na mas maaga, di hamak, hindi kinailangan mag-impose ng lockdown. At kung hindi kailangan mag-impose ng lockdown, or at least mas restricted na lockdown, hindi lalaki ng gano'n yung bilang ng unemployed natin. So kumbaga, kung may comedy of errors, ito may tragedy of errors. Expand, nagpatagpad ng lockdown na napaka-masaklaw, napakatagal, tapos wala pang binigyan na sapat na emergency relief sa panahon ng lockdown. So parang, alam mo yan, medyo nagkaroon ng cumulative problem. I think, hindi natin dapat tanggapin yung ganong klaseng sitwasyon. Lalo na, actually yan ang sinyalis natin na even yung darating na pag-responde ng government ay hindi rin actually magiging ganong ka-effective. So I think, the government really has to accept a lot of accountability for naging problems niya. Instead of yung lingguhan na sinasabi, all is well, ginagawa namin ng lahat. Kung ganda ng attitude, I think lalo tayo may hirapan bumangon from yung current crisis natin.
Okay. Roseby? Oh, sige. Yung second question.
Pa-relay na lang po.
Yes, sir.
Naririnig mo po?
Yes.
Okay. Yung kaugnay nung related na rin sa ABS-CBN shutdown. What are the chances na in the light of yung yung push ng Duterte government for a charter change no, that would allow 100% ownership ng nauna na yung mga public utilities tapos baka susunod na dyan yung land and media. What are the chances na ang target talaga ay foreign capital na pumasok sa to take over what ABS-CBN has been operating or been parang may kinalaman kaya, matter of speculation din, may kinalaman kaya itong ABS-CBN shutdown doon sa push for a 100% foreign ownership sa media?
Okay.
Sa tingin nyo, in your analysis?
Okay. So relaying to them the question.
Okay.
Wala ako natinig. Sorry.
Okay lang.
Echo din na
Yes.
malakas-lakas.
Okay, chinat ko yung question. Kasi
Okay.
nag-echo ang boses
Ah.
sa pag-repeat. Medyo mahirap.
Audrey?
Yes, Rosby.
Can we do
Go
a
ahead,
fast
Rosby.
talk?
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to answer yung unang tanong sana ni Kenneth, no. Actually, I was also I wanted to do a fast talk dun sa unang tanong din ni Atom, but I'll go back to that. Yung about the unemployment. Actually, adding lang dun sa sinabi na ni Sunny na dapat hindi tayo nag-lockdown kasi if we come to realize that yung majority of our workers would actually have to be mobile. Sila ay hindi naman sila bahay to work, A lot of them are informal workers who need to go around, lumabas talaga ng bahay at nasa labas talaga sila. So that was the first mistake na nagkaroon kaagad ng lockdown na hindi niya kinonsider yung composition ng ating mga manggagawa. But having said that, I agree na dapat talaga yung ayuda ay nagbigay sa kanila ng tamang support. No? I remember in February, I had the chance to go to Saigon, to Vietnam. And there, hindi sila naka-lockdown. They had community quarantine. Tapos ang ginagawa sa kanila, hinahatid doon sa mga naka-quarantine na manggagawa, yung sweldo nila or yung ayuda, which is even higher than their daily salaries, no, daily wages. So yung ganong klaseng governance o paggugobyerno, that's something na hindi natin nakita sa atin, and it's something talaga na sinabi naman natin kanina is brought about by the Duterte government's indifference. Siguro bago si Sunny, no, dun sa tanong ni Kenneth na ano yung possibility na foreign capital talaga yung mag-take over sa ABS-CBN. Ano yan, everything's falling into place. No? Yung Chacha is actually about opening up media and advertising doon sa 100% foreign ownership. So hindi malayo that it will be up, no, for grabs or up for bidding ng foreign capital. Tapos, even before this, syempre, meron naman na talagang ganong plano in terms of kung paano nagbubukas din yung administration build sa kanyang, sa digital technology and other ICT, no, sa teknolohiyang ganon. Kaya hindi malayo talaga. At yun talaga yung plano, no. Ang implication kasi noon hindi lang doon sa advertising, which means it's going to be corporate driven, no, yung dominant media or yung kung paano rin papasukin yung media ng corporate interest. Magkaka-implication pa rin yon doon sa content, which will still be corporate driven. So, and now it's foreign, no. Tapos sabi pa natin Walt Disney is the number one outfit, so it's going to be not just entertainment, but it's going to be really disinformation, and it's something we don't need right now. Yon. Hello? Pwede pa ba mag-fast talk? Yes, yun dun kay Atom, one word lang. Kasi magandang elaboration ni Science sa MSMEs, pero the first policy that we should do is mass testing. Yun yung mag-mass testing tayo para alam natin sino sino yung i-quarantine natin, that kind of science. Yung pangalawa is I would just like to mention na yung 900, almost 1 trillion pesos, it's lying there, the budget for build. So we can actually realign yung build para mas makapag-build tayo ng quarantine facilities, public health facilities, at iba pang mga technology or even manufacturing para maharap natin yung pandemya. So yun lang. Salamat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Roseby. Sunny, are you still here with us?
Struggling to keep up.
Yeah, did you catch the question that was chatted?
I don't know. No. Chat saan? May chat ba itong Nemo?
Sa CG, yes, sa CG natin.
Hanapin ko. Next question na lang. Sige lang, please.
Okay, sige po.
Yung
time natin.
Alright. So to move on, we would like to welcome our next friend from the media, Paul Soriano of Now You Know.
Sir Sunny, saka ni Ma'am Roseby.
Yes, that is the case. So i-chat na lang namin sa kanila muna ang question.
Alright. So, well, I have yung first question ko sana is directly to the narinig yung sarili ko. It's directed to the education, but I guess it can be answered by our sector representatives later. No? I would like to know what options are, no, when it comes to keeping up with still continuing the education for the youth. This is because my key takeaway from this forum ay yun na-expose lang actually ng pandemic. Katulad ng sinasabi kanina, na-expose lang ng pandemic yung long-standing na economic problems brought about by some of the inefficient government policies din. So, and we know that directly affected din ng economic stability and the entire economic situation, yung political at cultural, the socio-cultural na aspeto ng pamumuhay ng mga kababayan natin. So, this pandemic will already sacrifice education of the youth, and I would like to know more about that, but I guess that can be answered by the sector representative later. So I just had to bring it out. But for Sir Sunny, would like to know, kasi kanina yung question ni Sir Atom was about what can lawmakers and the government do. Also, na-establish na rin natin kanina na if the government has responded earlier to the threats of the pandemic, no onset pa lang niya ay mas naging okay sana yung situation, or we could have prevented a lot of grave things happening, no? But my question is, what is the task at hand for ordinary people? I mean, Now You Know has been working with a lot of people's organizations, civil society organizations, and this is what we need to know. So what is the task at hand for NGOs, for private sectors, and even individuals, no? At that time that, as you claim, the government is failing to address this pandemic and the needs of the people. So ano yung task at hand for us, no? For media practitioners, for non-government organizations, and for individuals, na paano, is there a way we can systematize, for example, the pockets of bayanihan na nangyayari ngayon? So yes, that's my question. Thank you.
Did you see the chat of the question? Okay, either one of you.
Okay, I think I'll do by time. I see the chat because I don't think Sunny can see a chat, no? It's also in the chat group. So I'll just mention the first question, Sunny. On education, what are the options when it comes to continuing education, no, of the youth? Tapos, the second question is what options are with continuing education? Key takeaway, what task at hand for organizations, no? Okay. And for media practitioners. I'll answer the education part. Then probably we can have a conversation on the other, um, um, on the organizations and civil societies and NGOs. No? Doon sa education part, if yung continuing education, I would like to interpret this as a question, no, doon sa formal education. Alam naman natin na tinamaan talaga siya ng kung ano man yung tatawaging new normal. And yet, our government is still not prepared, no, kung paano niya ipagpapatuloy ito given, no, yung kanyang kawalan din, no, ng preparations. There are a lot of issues, but I'll boil them down to siguro 4 na issues that government has to address before we can really talk about continuing education of the youth or even continuing school. No? Yung isa, of course, it's government's responsibility to prepare yung sector or even to prepare yung teachers kung paano sila haharap sa isang klase ng new normal, no, sa pagtuturo. Then secondly is that there is a proposal, for example, to limit yung number of contact sa klase, no, of contact time or even physical contact to, for example, about just 20 or 25 students. I'm sorry, I'm interpreting it sa aspeto ng formal education talaga. I think that's not feasible right now. No, bago mag-COVID, we were already doing 45 to 60 students or even yung sabay, no, na tig-30, palipat-lipat lang yung teacher. So again, government has to solve that, yung kakulangan na yan. The other thing is that how do we continue now if the statistics show that, for example, 2% of the total students in public schools are the only ones who have access to laptops or even tablets. And then just about less than half of public schools, no, eskwelahan to, hindi to mga estudyante, have internet connection. So again, that's a problem when you say mag-online na lang tayo. And lastly, and I think this has more relevance to the question, is that yung mismo ngang itinuturo, no, the curriculum itself in the beginning was already questionable. Hindi siya for service, hindi siya mass-oriented. Our educational system remains so unscientific. At saka, elite siya. Sabi ko nga, only 2% have access to laptop. So, yun na lang talaga ngayon, no, ang makakapag-aral. But even the curriculum has perpetrated this kind of culture na kung saan ay it's so elitist and commercialized and unscientific, no? Maniniwala sila sa kung ano man yung sasabihin sa kanila, etc. And now, under COVID, the DepEd wants to even reduce or streamline the learning competency. So medyo nakakabahala siya. So that's to answer the first question. I leave the next question to Sunny, no, yung doon sa what can NGOs or civil society organizations do from the start. But I would just like to give a first step, which is maningil tayo. Maningil tayo sa sobrang kapabayaan ng pamahalaan ng ginawa niya sa atin. Hindi lang ito incompetence, na parang hindi siya nakakope sa pandemic, kundi sinadya niya itong kapabayaan.
Sige, Sunny, may reply ka for the second question? Yes.
mahina yung education
Lost
system.
Sunny?
Oops. Hello?
Yes, nagsasalita si Sunny.
Okay, sorry game?
Yes, game.
Sige. Before answer my immediate task, I think kunin natin yung core insight from yung difficulties natin na harapin yung pandemya. Kaya hirap na hirap tayo contain yung pandemic ay dahil mahina yung government capacity sa health. Kaya hirap na hirap tayo mag-adjust sa open ng schools dahil napaka-fragmented at mababang capacity ng education system natin. I think kailangan mo ko yung core insight. Kaya tayo nahihirapan ngayon kasi over the last 4 decades, sa halip na palakasin ang public health system, sa halip na palakasin ang public school system, sa halip na palakasin ang lokal na ekonomiya, inubayan natin sa liberalisasyon, all the mga bad things na nalaman natin through the years. Ngayon, tingin ko mahalaga na maging clear yung insight na yun. Kasi kung makuha yung insight na yun, doon may tatakda at immediate tasks natin. Ang immediate tasks natin, harapin yung pandemya ngayon. At hindi siya mariresolba ng merkado. Hindi siya mariresolba ng corporate social responsibility, ng individual charity. Kailangan gumalaw ng gobyerno. Hindi may iwasan. Siya lang may recurso para sa lahat ng gastusin, para sa health, education, pagbago ng ekonomiya, pagsuporta sa mga mahirap ng pamilya. Ngayon, so immediate task, based on that core insight, i-demand natin yung gobyerno. Gumalaw kayo. Yun ulitin yung ginagawa nyo dati na maglalabas kayo ng tinging pera tapos nakaprioritize sa makikinabang dyan yung mga negosyante or yung foreign creditors. So mali na yun eh. So malino sa atin ano yung pagdating sa kanila at yung pagdating dapat ng direksyon nun. Ngayon, para ma-assert yun, actually, mahabang proseso, but pwede natin gawin yun. Mag-ingat tayo, maningin sa buong cellphone, makialam. Kasi kung makialam siya ngayon, at effective yung pakikialam niya, susugpo natin yung pandemya, balik sa pag-aaral yung mga bataan natin, makakabangan yung ekonomiya. And then hopefully, kapag ma-realize na yung only solution ay pakikialam ng gobyerno, kahit talagpasan na natin yung pandemya, yun ang dapat gawin para resolve yung matagal ng kahirapan, wala ng trabaho, pagiging atrasado ng ekonomiya. So next step doon, responsible pa rin ng gobyerno na pauna rin yung ekonomiya sa lahat ng kanilang. And I think, ang laki ng challenge na yun, pero ang laking binubukas para sa atin ngayon. And I think, the more na ma-assert natin sa malawang gobyerno ngayon, the more magiging malinaw sa buong sambayanan, even yung mga long-term problems natin, yun din ang kailangan. Responsible government, gumagalaw na may transparency, gumagalaw na may accountability. Hindi yung unfortunately nakasanayan natin.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much po.
Alright, thank you, Paul. For our next question, please welcome Sir Melo Acuña of CBCP News. Hello po. Sir Melo? Okay. While we wait for Sir Melo, let's go on to our next friend from the media. I would like to introduce Ms. Kai Ordinario of Business Mirror. Hello. Yes, hello Kai.
Breakdown natin at 297 billion transfers. Ang halo-halo siya ng cash transfers para sa days, wage subsidies, hindi lang para sa workers sa formal economic wage subsidies din through work schemes para sa informal sector. including yung farmers engagement natin. And then also, syempre, sa mga vulnerable senior citizens. So it's 297 billion in cash transfers, not for mga enterprises, but for households para ma-maintain yung aggregate demand. Kasi right now talaga, ang pinakamalaking bara natin is not yung surplus, is not yung kakulangan ng capacity ng mga negosyante to respond. Ang pinakabara natin is yung kakulangan ng aggregate demand sa local economy. And tingin namin, kung gawin yung dapat palaking yung suporta sa mga micro, small, and medium enterprises natin. And I think, totoo naman na very limited yung resources ng gobyerno. Pero kaya namin binabalik palagi, if the government can allot 898 billion for infrastructure projects, and if a portion of that, halimbawa for rail projects, I think about 60 billion is allotted for rail projects for 2020. And leakage kasi rail project. Magandang yes, but it's more priority na bigyan ng pera sa bulsa yung mahirap ng mga pamilya para magiging aggregate demand. I think dapat may ganong klaseng prioritization.
Okay.
Sir, sorry, follow up lang, short lang. Yung 297, that's every month.
Ang proposal namin 297
total
monthly cash transfers to.
Okay. Thank you po.
Okay. Is Sir Melo here, Acuña? Okay. Go ahead, Sunny.
I think dapat maging malinaw tayo na kulang talaga yung planong stimulus package ng government. Nilabas yung guidelines for the 2021 budget. Lumilitaw yung increase sa 2021 budget of about 5.7%. Pinakamaliit siyang increase in the last decade. So even dun sa kung nahihirapan ngayon mag-raise ng pondo dahil nga sa gitna tayo ng 2020, even for 2021, yung plano ng gobyerno ay actually hindi gumastos. And I think yun ang danger kasi kung hindi gumastos yung gobyerno, madadapa talaga yung ekonomiya. So I think isang malaking sign yun na apparently for the next year actually, even for the year after that, pumapasok tayo sa isang austerity mode. So if we recall, the last 3 years have seen increasing budgets, including for infrastructure, bumagal pa rin ang ekonomiya. If the next 2 years see lower budgets, lalong babagal ang ekonomiya. So I think it's, kailangan mas-stress talaga yon. And the government, I think it's incumbent sa kanya na maghanap ng rekurso para sa kinakailangan gastusin para makabangon ang ekonomiya.
Sir Melo's having a problem with his audio. Sir Melo, are you with us now? Okay. So what we'll do is we'll just return to Sir Melo once maayos na yung audio. And so in the meantime, thank you again to our friends in the media that have raised their questions and their comments so far. But we'll go on to the next portion of our Q&A, and that will be to hear from representatives of affected sectors that have been affected by the crisis. And we have with us health workers, consumers, agriculture and industry advocates, education, and government agencies. So let's call on first Mr. Brian Hieronimo of Young Christian Workers. Yes, magandang hapon po.
mas lalong tumitindi yung kahirapan na nararanasan ng mga kabataang manggagawa ngayon dahil sa kapalpakan ng pamahalaan sa pagtugon sa krisis ng pangkalusugan. Alam natin na yung tanggalan sa trabaho ay malala na yan kahit pa noong wala pa yung COVID-19. Laganap na yung tanggalan sa trabaho dahil sa umiiral na sistemang kontraktualisasyon. At nadagdagan lamang ito ng mas mataas ng pinatupad yung lockdown ng gobyerno laban para labanan yung COVID-19. At karamihan sa amin, sa mga kabataang manggagawa ay papabilang din kami sa hanay ng mga gagawang kontraktual na sa karanasan kapag nagkaroon ng tanggalan, kami yung unang tinatanggal sa trabaho. Yung iba naman ay sa panahon ng pandemya, yung iba naman ng mga manggagawa natin ay wala na ring nabalikan na trabaho dahil 5 buwan lang yung kanilang kontrata. At ang mas malala pa nga ay patanggal. Binuksan na yung iba't ibang industriya. Sa mga dahilang hindi naman talaga garantiya na ligtas yung mga manggagawa sa COVID-19. Wala namang libreng mass testing sa mga pagawaan eh. Pati nga yung alcohol at face mask ay kailangan pang manggaling sa mga manggagawa. Wala rin tayong wala ring libreng transportasyon doon sa mga manggagawa. Actually, naging dagdag pasanin pa yun eh, yung kawalan ng maayos na free na transportation dahil tumaas din yung pamasahe. At halimbawa po yung sa karanasan ng mga manggagawa doon sa Valenzuela, kung dati 30 pesos lang sa isang araw yung nagagastos sa pamasahe nila, ngayon ay nasa mahigit 100 na, 120. So yung pagbabago at pagtaas ng pang-araw-araw na gastusin ay malaking bagay yun para sa isang manggagawa. Nakakarampot lang naman yung sweldo. At apektuhan din yung budget sa pagkain nila sa araw-araw. Lalo na dun sa mga manggagawa na umaasa lamang dun sa pang-araw-araw na kita. At dahil sa kaliwat kanan na tanggalan sa trabaho, yung mga manggagawa ay nag-aalangan din ng magreklamo dahil natatakot silang mawalan ng trabaho. Madali rin kasi para sa mga kumpanya yung magtanggal ng kanilang empleyado eh. Lalo na kung contractual ka lang. Alam namin na maaring mamatay sa gutom mga manggagawa kapag nawalan sila ng kabuhayan dahil unang-una, wala namang konkretong programa yung pamahalaan sa mga manggagawang nawalan ng hanap buhay. Halimbawa na lang yung pamimigay ng amelioration. Maraming mga manggagawa ang hindi nakatanggap ng ayuda. Halimbawa na lang yung sa camp ng Department of Labor. At sa halip na tugunan ng pamahalaan yung problemang kinakaharap ng mga manggagawa, tila nagagamit din ito ng gobyerno para mas lalong gipitin yung mga manggagawa. Halimbawa lamang nung yung inilabas ng Department of Labor and Employment na Department Order 213 na kung saan lumalabas na parang sinususpindi din yung karapatan ng mga manggagawa. Parang ito yung nagpapakita lamang ng kawalan ng malasakit ng pamahalaan sa mga manggagawa. Kahit sa gitna ng matinding krisis, makikita natin na dihado pa rin yung mga manggagawa. Dagdag pa natin, yung mga niratsyada rin sila na kontra mamamayan, kontra manggagawa ng batas gaya ng Anti-Terrorism Act. At kung ganito yung pag-iisip ng mga namumuno sa ating bansa, sa tingin ko ay mas lalo lamang malalagay sa matinding panganib yung kalagayan at kinabukasan ng mga kabataang manggagawa. Habang tumatagal ay mas lumalala yung krisis sa pangkalusugan at habang nananatiling mabagal yung tugon ng pamahalaan laban sa pandemya, magkakaroon din ito ng malawakang epekto sa pagkasira ng kabuhayan ng mga kabataang manggagawa at mananatili yung matinding kagutuman at kahirapan. Sa ngayon, sobra-sobra na nga yung
Nawala ang audio ni Brian. Okay. Try again.
Hello. Ay, Ras. Saan ka na ba? Nabalita mo na.
Somebody's talking, but it's not me.
May alam ka na? May alam ka na?
Sino po ito? Okay, so Sunny, are you still here with us, or Rose B? Okay. Oh, nandito naman ako. Hello? Okay. Sunny or Rose B, can either of you hear me right now?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any initial reaction to what Brian Geronimo shared from the Young Christian Workers?
Ako isa lang mahalaga. Kailangan talaga bigyan ng priority yung mga tao. Yung pag-isip ng gobyerno na ang tulong sa ekonomiya ay tulong sa negosyante, kulang na kulang yun. Kung hindi niya siresohin na ang ekonomiya ay yung tao, na kailangan tulong ng mga gagawa na manatiling mataas ang sahod para may pambili sila, na yung mga nasa informal sector ay may pambili para ma-maintain na kailang pagkonsumo, mananatiling tapa ang ekonomiya. So I think gusto lang i-highlight yung nabanggit kanina na yung dole wage wage order, hindi wage order, yung administrative number 17. Kung ang effect niya ay lalong pabuhin yung sahod ng manggagawa, lalong bababang aggregate demand sa ekonomiya, lalong hindi siya makakatayo.
Okay, thank you. Rose B?
Yeah, actually yung sharing sa atin, ipinapakita niya na kung may tatamaan man sa pagdating ng graver crisis, no? At yun naman yung sinasabi natin na mangyayari in the coming months and years. Talagang nasa sangkalan yung manggagawa. At ang masaklap kasi dito, gusto kong idagdag dun sa shinare sa atin, ay bukod sa pagbabawas ng sweldo, pagbabawas ng benefits, at even tanggal, no? Yan yung mga tinitingnan na natin na pwedeng mangyari. Bukod doon kasi nakikita natin na mas matindi yung labor rights violations na nakaamba doon sa ating mga manggagawa. That, for example, even forming unions or even union actions o yung kanilang mga rights to strike, or not just to organize but to strike or even to negotiate, can also be now interpreted as terrorism, no, under the anti-terrorism law na nagsasabing ito ay maaaring it will go against public safety or against public interest. So pwede na siyang i-lump together as terrorism, at sobrang sobrang violation at pag-curtail din, hindi lang ng freedoms ng ating mga manggagawa at ng mga union, kundi ng kanilang mga matagal nang naipaglaban na mga karapatan. Yun ang gusto ko idugtong.
Okay, thank you, Roseby. So let's move on to our next representative from the sector. Thank you again, Brian, for your sharing of the situation of workers. Our next speaker or representative from the sector is Melanie Cabotaje of UP Institute for Small Scale Industries. Ms. Melanie? Magandang hapon po.
Mag-share tungkol sa ginawa naming pag-aaral noong April, yung first survey namin. Tungkol sa epekto ng pandemya at ng ECQ sa ating mga negosyante. We had 108 respondents at ang 65% ng aming respondents ay nagsara ng negosyo. 58% nagkaroon ng problema sa cash flow nila. Another 58% hindi nakapag-report sa trabaho dahil sa walang masakyan. 57% bumaba ang benta at kita. At marami rin sa kanilang nagkaroon ng delay sa delivery ng orders at raw materials dahil na rin sa hindi naging malinaw na guidelines sa mga checkpoint patungkol sa movement ng goods. At during this time, again, this was in April, sobrang hirap yung nararamdaman ng ating mga MSMEs. Halos wala silang nakuhang suporta sa gobyerno. Only 18% ang merong assistance, pero very dismal din yung klase ng assistance. 14% received relief goods at 6 ang at that time nakapag-apply ng CAMP o ito nga yung programa ng DOLE, COVID-19 Adjustment Measure Program. So during this time, MSMEs were seemingly left to fend for themselves. Kanya-kanyang diskarte ang nangyari. Ask what assistance they would need to be able to recover from the effects. Ang mga sagot po ng ating respondents ay tax break, interest-free loan, training on BCP or business continuity planning, wage subsidy para sa mga affected na empleyado, and provision of working capital. So in response to this crisis, merong mga ni-roll out na programa ang gobyerno, mainly loan programs. Ito yung pondo sa pagbabago, wage subsidy, nandiyan yung CAMP ng DOLE, at yung small business wage subsidy na ni-roll out ng DOF at ng SSS. At meron pa ring mga loan programs na pinapatupad ng ating mga government banks, BBP and Land Bank. Pero tama si Sunny kanina, kulang na kulang yung budget. Relevant yung programa, pero kulang yung finances. At dahil nga kulang sa budget, nagiging first come, first serve basis ang dating. Kung titignan mo nga, masyadong maikli yung siniset na application period. For example, we have the DOF's, yung Small Business Wage Subsidy. 3 weeks lang yung binigay nilang application, 3 weeks lang yung application period. Sa kaso ng CAMP, CARES, yung pondo sa pagbabago, marami pang nag-a-apply, but they had to stop accepting application. So isang problema yung kulang sa budget, and we cannot overemphasize that. Pangalawa, yung kakulangan ng sense of urgency. Nagsara na ang mga negosyo at kumpanya, wala pa rin yung ayuda. Masyadong mabagal yung pag-respond. And these are 2 recommendations ng ISSI na una, yung dagdagan yung pondo para mas ma-expand yung coverage niya and even ma-reach niya yung informal economy. Pangalawa, yung i-lessen yung proseso, mas streamline yung process ng application. At pangatlo, gusto din namin i-reinforce yung sinabi ni Rose B kanina tungkol sa mass testing. Kasi kulang pa yung, dahil sa sobrang taas ng cases ng ating ng COVID-19 sa Pilipinas, kulang na kulang yung confidence ng tao to move forward and restart the economy. Kulang yung lumalabas, kaya baba din yung spending, household spending natin. At dahil dyan, syempre, lugi yung mga negosyante natin. So kung naging mahirap yung sitwasyon para sa mga MSMEs during the ECQ, hindi rin talaga nagiging madali sa kanila itong post-ECQ season na to. So hindi siya business as usual. Kaya mas kailangan ng i-harmonize ng gobyerno ang kanilang mga programa at dagdagan yung budget para sa mga programa na niro-roll out. Yun lang po. Salamat.
Hello? Can you hear?
Yes, yes, on.
Mahalaga talaga sa atin ngayon yung through research, through scientific study, kung ano yung pinagdadaan natin. Again, going back dun sa ating pwede natin gawin, hindi lang ng mga institutes at mga civil society organizations, tuloy-tuloy talaga na paglatag yung truths, yung results of scientific researches. Salamat din sa intervention.
Sige. Para sa akin, very welcome yung results ng survey. I think ina-affirm din naman yung marami sa pinag-uusapan dun sa IBON. I think all the more kaya siguro mapapastrate yung mga MSMEs kung madidinig nila economic managers at sasabihin palagi infrastructure at build, yung sikreto natin dito sa pag-resolve pa ng crisis or pagbukas sa foreign investment and competitiveness. I think lalo silang magagalit. So in the same way na yung urgency talaga sa atin ay ma-push yung government in general na harapin yung crisis, I think yung micro, small, and medium enterprises dapat ma-register much more strongly na yan ang local economy. Parang yan ang foundation sa local economy. Sana wag yung abstractong competitiveness and attracting foreign investment. Sana hindi nga yun ang maging attitude ng government. And I think the more MSMEs speak out, baka the more na mag-respond na maayos ng government.
Just a reminder to let's please keep our comments or questions brief due to the time constraints, due to the technical difficulties early. Okay, so I would like to now introduce Chris Panerio of Masipag. Sir Chris?
Yung import dependence sa industriya, lalo yung build, no? Yung import dependence din sa agrikultura na plant naman na pagpapatuloy lang ng sabi nga ni Rosby na neoliberal illusion na para mapaunlad ang ekonomiya. At ang isa pang mahalagang takeaway ay yung COVID pandemic ay pinakita lang yung napakahina ng ating ekonomiya para maka-adapt o maka-angkop sa isang napakalaking krisis pandaigdigan, no? At uh, siyempre ang lunas dito ay kailangan magkaroon talaga ng self-reliant economy o isang ekonomiya na nagpo-promote ng economic independence. Dito natalakay natin sa people's economics na kaya natin gawin. Halimbawa, yung genuine industrialization, napakahalagang gawin natin ito para makaahon tayo sa ekonomiya, nakaahon ng ating ekonomiya. Sa masipag, yung konsepto ng self-reliance ay nagawa namin. Matagal din ito na proseso pero kayang talagang gawin. No? Halimbawa, ang mga farmers organization ng masipag ay mula doon sa mga umabot na doon sa pagbebenta ng kanilang surplus organic na mga produkto, na mga processed product ito. No? Ibig sabihin, from raw materials na food products ay naproseso nila ito pa sa mga finished products. At napakarami. Bigas, from palay to bigas, mga prutas na patungong fruit wines, etc. No? Ito yung dapat nating gawin at dapat gawin din sa yung tinatawag na genuine industrialization. Kasi napakarami nating raw materials at napakarami nating talented na human resource na kayang iproseso ito sa finished products para hindi lang mga dayuhang kapital ang makinabang kundi mga Pilipino. Meron tayong malaking market na pwedeng mag-absorb ng mga produkto na ito. So yun ang take away ko rito, no? Kailangan magkaroon tayo ng independent economic policy na hindi umaasa lang sa neoliberal illusion na pinapakalat ng ating mga economic planners. At napakita namin sa masipag, sa aming maliit na karanasan, mga 50,000 families siguro ang naabot na namin. Pero hindi ito sapat. No? Kailangan ang ginagawa ng masipag, yung people-led agroecology ay mas mapalawak at makatulong sa pagpapalakas ng people's movement, no? Ng peasant movement, ng farmers movement, para yung sinasabi ni Rosby kanina na maningil, no? Singilin natin yung ating pamahalaan sa mali na mga palisiya sa pagharap dito sa pandemic na ito na nagdulot ng paglala ng ating krisis pang-ekonomiya. Lamang po at maraming salamat.
Rosby? Okay na? May comment pa kayo sa sinabi ni Sir Chris? Okay na. Okay, for our next guest representative, I'd like to introduce Attorney Bong Inchong of United Broilers Association. Are you here, Attorney? Okay. Wala pa siya, I think. So we'll move on to our next guest, Ms. Toix Serna of Commute. Hello, Toix. Okay, wala din pala. So moving on to our next and last, Dr. Josh San Pedro of the Coalition for People's Right to Health. Doc Josh?
Sa Birdtalk, no? And of course, I agree with yung sinabi ng speakers natin that talagang we can see that the response to COVID-19 is still not being responded to by our government properly. At talagang hindi natin maihiwalay yung ekonomiya doon sa kalagayang pangkalusugan ng ating mga mamamayan. How can we expect to have a healthy economy when our people themselves hindi pa natin naayos, no? Yung yung kanilang kalagayan sa kanilang kalusugan, na marami pa rin tayong cases that the cases continue to surge. It affects all the other businesses, and of course yung lumalabas na ngayon, no, na uh, what we saw in March, yung with all the cases ng COVID-19 na tumataas, filling out our hospitals, and the surge of cases back in March, it looks exactly the same as it is now. And that was before any major quarantine was implemented, no, back in ECQ no March, no. And then after na ma-implement, we slowed down that quarantine, and then ngayon we see the same results, no, na tumataas ulit yung cases, our hospitals are being full. So it's really showing na hindi talaga naging effective, no. We haven't bought time, we haven't developed. So how can we expect naman talaga that our state can respond to this epidemic, especially since our health sector has been dramatically reduced in its funding, no? Especially yung dun sa sinasabi ni Sir Sani kanina, the Epidemiology Bureau was defunded, and in general, our health sector has been one of the lowest funded sectors of our government. That in 2019, of the GDP natin na 19.5 trillion, the health budget was only 185.5 billion. So that's just barely 1%. No? So how can we expect better health outcomes kung ganito kababa yung ating health funding? How can we expect na magkaroon ng robust health response ang government natin if it has let our health infrastructure rot and be complacent with these structures, no, na hindi talaga naayos yung ating sistemang pangkalusugan, na tuloy-tuloy pa rin yung pag-privatize ng ibang hospitals, tuloy-tuloy pa rin yung pag-defund ng ating basic health services. And we even see now, no, that even the promised universal healthcare law and universal healthcare system is currently in jeopardy because sabi nga po na PhilHealth, wala daw enough money for the implementation of the promised universal healthcare. So yung lumalabas nga po, yung lumabas din sa pre-SONA forum, that of the 374.9 billion, there was only just 48 billion lang yung binigay for health. So that's around 12% of the plan. It's still not a lot, no? It's still not the majority of the funding that is currently being given in this crisis. So looking forward, how can we expect our economy to really rise kung even our health system is still not funded? No, there's still no commitment on the side of our government to increase its funding for healthcare, to improve the livelihood, no? Ang bagal-bagal ng pagpataas ng sahod ng kahit mga basic natin na frontliners, that it takes so much just for them to get the lawfully required na minimum entry salary, that most of them are still subject to contractualization and volunteerism, no, during this pandemic. And so yeah, I guess yung reaction din po namin on the health sector, and the question for our speakers is that how is it looking forward, kasi with regards to funding the health sector on the side of our government, because how can we expect for there to be a new normal if we haven't even funded properly anything in our healthcare system, when the new normal should not just be about how to live under a pandemic, but really to raise the level and standard of healthcare para sa ating mga mamamayan, na patotohanin natin na karapatan talaga sa kalusugan. Kasi nga yung ngayon pa lang, yung testing, yung tracing, yung treatment, and yung quarantine, they're taking so long, ang daming backlogs, ang daming delays. So it really boils down to that commitment, no? How willing is our government to realize that healthcare is a right, and how willing are they to fund that talaga in the future, especially towards yung so-called new normal na wala naman talagang commitment on the part of our government.
May response po kayo, Sani or Roseby?
Ako pwede click lang. Ay, sige.
Hindi. Actually, dun sa part na sinabi ni Doc Josh yung question, nag-lightning thunder sa lugar ko. So, I missed the question. So, sana ma-repeat ni Audrey.
Yun. Sorry, di ko ma-repeat kasi nag-curate ko ng questions right now sa ibang chat box. So, sorry, Doc Josh,
So, sige, si Sunny,
yes,
siguro
you.
na 5%. In 2019, it was just 1%. I mean, in 2020 coming in, it was just 1% of our GDP. Paano natin i-expect na kung wala namang firm commitment in our government to have a higher budget for healthcare na ma-achieve natin yung new normal, na hindi lang dapat yung economy ang inuuna, although in the larger sense, a healthy economy is really based on the health of the people.
Ako mag-comment ako.
Yes, please.
Sige. Not to be depressing. Dun sa budget, actually, pasok na tayo sa isang period of austerity. And I think sobrang halaga i-stress yun because despite yung general slowdown sa budget increases in the coming years, ang laki pa rin ng plano ng government in terms of yung favored infrastructure projects niya, especially for mga transport and related infrastructure. I'm sure kapag nilabas na yung 2021 budget, ipi-play up nila na lumaki yung health response. Pero basically, kung hindi inuurungan ng government yung pag-rely on privatization and pag-push ng universal healthcare by incentivizing private hospitals for PhilHealth, I think yung pinapasukan natin na period, generally still not enough spending for public health. Magkakaroon ng momentary show of increase in spending for health because nasa COVID, kasi politically popular yan. Pero fundamentally, kung hindi inulungan yung privatization, hindi ko maisip kung paano papalaki ng government yung kanyang budget for health, both for facilities and for human resources. And again, mukhang ito nga yung, I think, moment talaga na pinapatampok health is a human right. Health is something the government has to spend on. Unfortunately, yung gobyerno, I think, gusto lang nila makaraos naman ng 2020, pagdating sa 2021, pag humupa na yung anxiety ng mga tao about health situation, mag-go back sila to normal. So I think may yung moment para mapakita. Kaya lumala lang health response natin ngayon is because of the past decades of privatization. Huwag na natin ulitin yun in the coming decades. Ito yung moment. Correct that. Really by spending more. At tamang sabi ni Doc Josh, gano'n ka-basic lang yun. Kailangan mag-commit to reforming the privatized health system.
Okay. Thank you, Sunny. Rose B? May dagdag?
Yes, Audrey, can you hear me?
Yes. Kahit echoey.
Okay. Dagdagan ko lang din, yung health talaga ay isa sa mga casualties ng global casualty ng privatization. So it started even with the strongest health systems and the most reliable health systems ng mga capitalist countries. So they also went through some process of privatization at pag-reduce ng support or even government responsibility. Gusto kong baliktarin yung tanong kasi it's a challenge actually for the sector, but at the same time a challenge for citizens. Doon sa health is a basic human right, and under the United Nations there's a Maastricht guidelines or siguro sabihin natin number 5, those documents na iniisa-isa niya kung paano talaga ine-ensure na ang isang society will realize, no, the right to health. Gusto kong ibalik na there is also, on the other hand, na sinasabi nga ni Doc Josh na how can you even achieve, no, economic rise kung hindi natin ma-address yung health ng citizens. On the other hand, in the Maastricht guidelines, there are social determinants, no, of the right to health. At yung social determinants na yun ay, it's the responsibility of the government to give decent wages, to give decent work, no, to respect the right to work, the right to wages, the right to till the land, the right to to produce, and even self-reliance. So, yung mga yon, social determinants yun no, para rin sa isang healthy society. Gusto ko na rin idagdag doon na kasama din sa assured rights na yon is there is a right to rebel, no? Right to rebellion, which is guaranteed by the United Nations. So yung sinasabi kanina ni Sunny na maningil, no? I-push talaga ang isang healthy na mamamayan na kaya niyang mag-produce for industrialization and agrarian reform, no? Yung paniningil na yon is also our right. So sabay-sabay na ine-exercise yon, the right to health, the right to an economic to development, and of course a right to rebellion. Kaya this is really a ripe opportunity, no, para itulak ng mamamayan na hindi lang Filipinos but the citizens of the world, na itulak siya to realize itong mga rights natin.
Okay, thank you, Rosby. Okay. Thank you, Doc Josh. May follow-up or... Okay, thank you.
Na yung mga face masks and of course with our test kits, it really just reveals how behind we are in our industrialization and basically funding our science and technology sectors. So it really just reveals, yung aside from the larger social determinants of health that continue to not be met in our society, yun po, talagang it's a wider thing, and we really have to address the problems with our inequality and economic inequity in our society before we can really say that our society is healthy enough and our economy is prospering. So talagang malaki pa ang kailangan singilin na sa mamamayan sa ating gobyerno para lumusog na maayos ang ating bansa. Maraming salamat.
Okay, maraming salamat, Doc Josh. Okay, thank you again to our friends in the media as well as our guests from the various sectors that shared their situation and their insights. So we will go on to the next portion of our Q&A where we'll be addressing some of the questions that have been coming in from Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Unfortunately, due to the technical difficulties that we've been experiencing, this has cut short our time in terms of being able to answer all these questions. So at this time, we'll just pick two questions that we would like to ask Sunny and Osby before we head towards the last portion of our program. So we have a question on government policy that came in through Zoom from Ligaya Boncoro. President Rodrigo Duterte's term will soon end, and not even half of the target of the Build program has been constructed. So while some of these projects were even started before his term. So the question is basically, you see that it hasn't even been completed, most of the projects. So why didn't he even start these projects? So Sunny or Roseby?
Sunny.
I was going to apologize because I couldn't hear the question. I had heard three voices talking at the same time. Sorry.
Ganun din ang situation ko. Sorry.
Sorry.
So let me just try to chat it. Can you...
It's naka-flash sa'yo?
Naka-flash. Nakikita nyo po ba?
Okay, Sunny? Can you read it? I'll just have a short note. No? Okay, sorry.
Okay. So review the question. PRD's term will soon end, and not even half of the target BBB has been constructed. Why? Well, some of these projects were even started before his term. Na-catch nyo po ba?
I was removed from the meeting.
Okay.
Okay, Rosalie. You're out,
But you are in Mimo.
I
You're
promise
in
to answer shorter next
mode.
time.
I have been removed.
Anyway, Sunny, if you can hear me, sagot lang ako konti. Just fast talk dun sa question. Bakit ang tagal na, no? Audrey, can you hear me? Wala. Sorry. There. Hello po.
Nakita nyo ang chat ko. I've been removed from the meeting.
Hello?
Narinig nyo ba ako?
I can hear you, but
Audrey?
can you hear me? Somebody has to tell me if you can hear me.
Sorry, hindi ko...
Rosby, I can hear you.
Hello?
Okay na po. Sige po. Answer the question
Okay.
na lang.
Can you hear me? I hope we will also stream sa Zoom, no? Because I will answer the question ng maiksi lang. Build po kasi, it's like, and to answer yung nagtanong, I always give the example of in the office when somebody asks, for example, for a new laptop, tapos ang powerful ng laptop, pero ang bagal pa rin naman niyang magsulat or lines. So, there is what we call absorptive capacity na kung saan, ang dami-daming projects na nandyan. Pero kung wala namang capacity yung government to manage or yung government to implement it, wala rin tayong capacity to even produce local materials for those projects, medyo bagal pa din talaga yung implementation and even the completion of those projects. So yun yung basic, we've been talking about privatization and liberalization, yun yung nagpahina rin doon sa government to have that absorptive capacity of grand infrastructure projects. Kaya tama yung nagtanong, matatapos na tayo sa termino ng Duterte administration, pero mukhang baka kaya na siguro mga hanggang 4 yung matatapos niya doon sa tinarget niya na 100 projects. Yan.
Okay, sorry, just experiencing some difficulties, technical difficulties. Sunny, may dagdag ka?
Sorry, I'm having a hard time keeping up. I'm trying my best, but
Pasensya po. I'm unable to join this meeting. Anyways, tuloy tayo. From where I'm at, wherever that may be. But yes. Our next question. Sunny, were you speaking? Sorry.
no. I'm trying to listen. I'm trying hard.
Okay, apologize. I can't. I'm not able to view you guys.
You're actually clear. I can hear you, Audrey.
Okay. All right. We have a question specifically for. Okay, sorry. Apologies, just a minute. I'm trying to. Yung next question from IBON FB, Abet Mercado. Why is DOF putting so much effort to raise foreign currency denominated debts from multilaterals when most of the required spending, income support, SME support, 4-piece ayuda are denominated in pesos?
Sige, ako na lang. When the government borrows, they always attempt to mix currencies and also payment terms. Because of the crisis, the government felt apparently that the World Bank and the IMF would be offering um, much much lower terms than on commercial rates. So they borrowed from the World Bank and the ADB and AIB because these were at lower than commercial rates. So it's also about mixing it up. But having that focus on tapping cheap ODA, the government actually is also borrowing locally. Right now, I know at least 60% of government debt is actually in peso denominated debt. So even the increase in foreign debt in the last 6 months won't actually substantially change the profile of the debt profile of the Philippines. So basically, they mix and match sources depending on the available options. And the COVID offered them cheap, well, they felt cheap ODA. Pero, sige nga, i-add ko na rin, actually, one of the things we're suggesting, because the government borrowed so much from development agencies, actually, this is a very good chance for the government to say, instead of borrowing from you again, and then accumulating new debt, we feel the government should have tried harder to ask for a restructuring of debt. So there's a lot of debt payments actually being made exactly to the World Bank and the ADB. Um, it seemed to make more sense to, instead of borrowing more from the same borrower, especially development agencies, to tell them, can we put off paying you, or can we restructure our debt payments to pay you longer? And then what we appropriated to pay for you, can we just use that instead for our COVID response? So I think the government could have been much more aggressive and more creative in approaching their debt problem.
Roseby, may dagdag ka ba?
Wala naman. It's just that yung for the last 4 months, for example, you can say na yung borrowing is about COVID, which I mentioned in the beginning. It's not really about COVID. It's about I'm going to borrow so that I have extra for reviving business. And I'm going to use COVID para yun yung dahilan, etc. Pero I'd just like to mention na yung last 4 or 5, or we're already on the 6th month, no? I still know 70% of the national outstanding government debt is domestic, no? Global bonds and other local bonds. So ibig sabihin lang, when you borrow foreign foreign nominated currency or from multilateral agencies, it's also showing off, no, that yeah, and that is good for business or even for business confidence na nakakahiram ka. And I think the DOF has exercised, no, that appeal na trinay niya talaga yung appeal niya na yes, I'm credit worthy and I'm all right, no, I'm okay. And in the end, napakaliit pa rin naman daw ng inutang niya doon sa gross domestic product as a share, no. But as we have discussed this whole afternoon, is that we're headed, no, towards one of the worst or maybe the worst crisis in our lifetime, in our recently, and that's something really to think about as we adjourn this meeting na papunta tayo sa isang collapse that is unprecedented, whether it's a debt-driven collapse, it's also a collapse driven by policies.
Unfortunately,
Audrey?
Yes. Can you hear me? Roseby?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So thank you again, Roseby. And
Yes,
Sunny.
yes.
Unfortunately, because of we're running a little bit out of time, those are all the questions that we can answer for today. So let's head towards our closing part of the program. Basically, from the speakers' presentations and what our friends from the media and the various sectors have shared, we can generally take away from this that even prior to the COVID pandemic and the consequent socioeconomic crisis, the Filipino economy and the health system was already having problems pre-COVID due to poor policies that were being implemented by the government. And so we see that instead of taking lessons from that situation, basing it at what are the current circumstances ng mga tao ngayon, yung overwhelmed health system, overwhelmed frontliners, at nakakita din natin that as a result ng mahabang lockdown, maraming unemployed, maraming nawalan livelihood, the government is still not making the correct policy choices that are more beneficial or towards the interests of the people. And we saw from the various sectors their sharing of their experiences, as well as additional insights from our speaker, how that speakers came to be, that essentially yung mga policy choices being made right now are more self-serving, more militaristic response, more policies serving the interests of big business, of the administration's cronies, rather than going towards what will genuinely address the ongoing health crisis and socioeconomic crisis. Pero nakakita din natin yung mga positive opportunities that could be taken if that are even coming from our own communities, own sectors, in terms of how can we address these ongoing problems. So to close our meeting, I would like to ask Sunny and Roseby if you could please share some parting words or parting points. So could we have first Roseby? Sunny?
Okay. I think Rosby disappeared. Ayan.
Actually, akala ko, okay, go, Sunny.
No. Sino na? Second point.
Okay. No, I'll go ahead. I thought your last slide was a good parting shot. So parang ayoko na siyang dagdagan na how we showed na it can really be an opportunity for the rise, no, upsurge, or kumbaga the renaissance, hindi pa nga no, kumbaga the continuing rise of people's movements and people's of pushing for people's choices, people's initiatives and movements, no? Wala nang tataas pa doon sa pagkilos. And I would just like to end that with that note. And of course, personally, I would like to say sorry for the technical difficulties. It's really kumbaga hindi timely that we at the height of our advocacy and of yung ating mga kinakalaban is that we try we try new things and new ways. Pero I think that's how we learn and that's how we move forward.
Ako na?
Yes.
Sige. Well, ako for me, I'd like to thank everyone who had the patience to stay after 3 hours of the difficulties. I think the most important takeaway for me from all the discussions and all the questions raised, I think it's clearer than ever the government can do something if only it wanted to. Right now, it's unfortunately not using the government well. There are many signs it's actually being, the resources authority of government are being used for self-serving purposes. But I think in the end, we need the government to act properly. If the government is unable or unwilling to act properly, we, as a citizenry, there is still much we can do. Right now, we can try our best to work through our representatives in Congress because they're supposed to be representatives. But I think more than ever, we're seeing we are able to make a difference by coming out into the streets, showing our showing our strength and our demands as a people. So I think at the very end, we can come out of this better. We can survive this. But I think most importantly, we should all come out and realize the government can do something, but we have to make it do and fulfill its responsibilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Sunny and Rose B. So that ends our program with those parting words ni Sunny and Rose B. We're keeping our registration open, so those who want to keep receiving updates can do so, especially perhaps continue this conversation. So yung mga questions that we were not able to answer. So again, thank you for bearing with us in regards to mga technical difficulties and yung pag-evolve ng online conversations ng IBON with you, our audience. So let's keep in touch, and to the next activity, we hope you'll still join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Signing off.
Thank you.
What has this administration accomplished?
The volcano started spewing ash. Philippine offshore gaming operators.
Unemployment for April rises to a record.
Country are now at 56,000.
Unang bahagi ng social amelioration subsidy.
The resolution to deny ABS-CBN franchise application.
Anti-terrorism bill has been signed into law.